So how do we think England's brat summer is going?
Well, someone out there is having a brat summer. I just don't know that it's me, you know?
Because, I mean, I don't know. It's tough to start episodes like this.
The key elements of having a brat summer, right? Doing a lot of cocaine and having fun with your friends. Now, if we identify who in this country right now is doing a lot of cocaine and having fun with their friends, it's pretty clear to see who's having the brat summer.
Who's on the receiving end of beatings from authority figures dressed up in uniform. You know? No, it's sometimes tough to talk about these things, right? Except by just asking, how are we all feeling about the ongoing and intensifying wave of race riots taking place up and down the country?
Well, I'll tell you one thing. I'm not feeling particularly Julia. If there's one person who's not having a brat summer, it's me.
No, I'm right there with you. I will be honest. I am not thrilled with this.
Keir Starmer should go and do a press conference where he says, I am not feeling very Julia today.
I was commenting to Hussein before we came down to record that it's weird because America obviously has a profound tradition of white race riots attacking minorities. It's sort of the history of America, particularly white people attacking black people. But there have been lots of other examples. The Zoot Suit riot in Los Angeles, for example, attacking Hispanic Americans. There's all sorts of things like this around. It's not just a song by the Cherry Poppin' Daddies from the weird swing revival in the late 90s. It was actually a race riot. But in modern times, it's sort of like the cops just do it for white people. Whereas in Britain, seeing this in the wild is sort of like, to me, obviously being a foreigner here, it's just sort of like, this is what Rosewood or Tulsa would have looked like. It's just hasn't gotten to that point yet. And I know that's like not comedy podcast fodder, but it's just one of those things where it's really shocking. And for me, I can't figure out if it's like, what's the Venn diagram overlap and the precise point of cops letting it happen versus there's 3 cops left in the country, so they can't stop it kind of thing. Because like, I don't believe the cops are unsympathetic in general to these views, but there's also the fact that most of the British state has been destroyed by the Conservative Party in terms of just like cutting everything. And so state capacity just is kind of non-existent. So it's just weird.
I think it's very much the latter in this case, right? Because generally speaking, as you see, it's like a lot of the same people who are like involved in like football hooliganism, like back in the day or like closer to, right? The kind of instinctive cop sympathy sort of ends once you like injure enough of them, which it really seems like the rioters here have been doing.
Yeah, fair enough.
And I think it's just a case of like, we defunded everything in such a way that not only did we make everyone's lives miserable, fuck the vibes, destroy a bunch of social cohesion, open people up to radicalism, but also now there's like 3 cops left.
Although I checked 2010 again. And I saw Nick Griffin getting embarrassed in front of Question Time, and the BNP were defeated after that.
That's true. That is true. So there must be something else going on here because it can't be fascism. And this is something that the media agrees with you on. I think a lot about the kind of like inherent right-wing sympathy of the kind of style guide, right? I saw a picture caption this morning that was like, anti-fascists confront people at a protest. And I'm like, there's got to be a more concise way to imagine the kind of people at a protest that anti-fascists might be confronting. But seemingly not, you know?
Sensible, patriotic Brits, of course.
Yeah, concerned motorists.
Yeah, I mean, they are probably all concerned motorists. But, you know, I mean, okay, look, so, for listeners in America who might not know, we talked about the race riots as they began in this week's...
and I hate being fucking vindicated, is the thing. I hate it when we're right, because we're never right about anything good.
Well, and again, we're going to sort of have a few of those moments throughout this episode. But we talked about those race riots when they were occurring. We talked also about how the British media, the mainstream media, has been encouraging them for years. And when the riots continued over the weekend, we saw a lot of British media people and MPs as well immediately start trying to either distance themselves from their previous comments, where it says, hey, all of my calls to action about how there are grooming gangs operating in Rotherham, or all of my calls that like, oh, Brits would need to be, the legitimate concerns about migration need to be addressed. Those concerns are independent, by the way, of like me and my friends asset stripping the state. All of that. Everyone who's made those claims has been now distancing themselves from them. Fucking Nick Go Home Vans Timothy has been saying, oh, well, we need a firm response and to round up the ringleaders of the riots.
This is partially true, right? Like, I think there's some people for whom they want to get off the bus now. They started the bus. They were big fans of everywhere it was going, but now they're like, I like law and order. I like it when, you know, there aren't riots, because riots are kind of like déclassé and frightening, right? I prefer like a sort of an orderly mass deportation, right? Whereas there are other guys for whom, not just guys, there are other people for whom the mask is getting really heavy, you know, and I think we're at a time where we're sort of seeing people concealing what they're about less and less in some cases. I mean, Farage has gotten very, very close.
Something that I found very interesting is the fact that smarter people and more observant people than me have noted this, that even in the wake of, you know, for example, Sarah Edwards, MP for Tamworth is a great example, not related to Milo as far as I am aware, basically specifically named a hotel in her constituency that was being used as a hostel for asylum seekers, and then that was targeted and has not apologized.
5 days later.
Has not backed down from any of it, and then the only concerns that are expressed are concerns for, well, I hope the property and the cops are okay. That there is no willingness to even empathize or even identify the victims. I saw coverage from the BBC in the first days of this, where they said something to the effect of like, you know, a brick wall was damaged and cars had their windows destroyed in the vicinity of a mosque. It's like, well, I wonder why that is. I wonder why that. Was it happenstance?
Yeah.
Was it just an accident? Did Google Maps glitch? Did they use Apple Maps by mistake?
A brick wall fell over when a localized earthquake occurred associated with a rioter crashing a fucking car into it.
And also, here's the thing, right? Everyone's always like, oh, well, because the BBC, once again, going on about like, well, some of these people are far right, but not all of them are far right. Some of them just have legitimate concerns about immigration. And, you know, as a notional, I suppose, immigrant in the sense that I'm not from here and I live here, here's my question. What are your legitimate concerns about it? Can you enumerate them?
They did spray paint them on the wall of that hotel. A lot of racial slurs in them, you know?
Yeah, the spray paint said we want it back to pre-1995 levels, but the mainstream media ignored that.
What do we want? Immigration back to pre-1995 levels. How do we want it? Over a structured delivery program. in
an incremental way. Yeah. Why does it say KS underneath?
Yeah, I knew he was wearing that Stone Island for a reason.
I think there is something to be said about, like, I'm really interested in like the people who have sort of been backtracking and the people who have sort of gone full mask off, because I think that's actually the interesting component.
Yeah.
And it sort of speaks to me as, like, I think for a while, what the sort of crisis that, or like the sort of issue that right-wing media has sort of had is that, like, while sort of laying the foundations for basically allowing this type of bigotry, be it like Islamophobia or transphobia, you know, lots of different like, you know, pogroms against lots of different people, is that as like they've sort of lost control of like the frequency of which this comes out, they've had to sort of like adapt to the new kind of the people who are sort of receptive to these types of stories, right? You know, it's like you can sort of see that there's a sort of lack of control in the way that there used to be. And so for a lot of these like pundits who have kind of made their names because they have links and associations to this audience, they now have to make this choice as to like, well, do you want to have a respectable like mainstream career in British society, in which case like you do kind of have to rein in some of the kind of like overt racism? Or do you kind of go fully unhinged because you know that's sort of what your audience wants? Because like there was like, I can't remember who it was, but there was like a GB News presenter who like did a tweet thread over the weekend, which sort of was along the lines of like, you know, this isn't the country that I kind of recognize. I reckon, you know, people are allowed to have, you know, legitimate concerns about immigration, but they can't act like this. And like the whole comment crew was just people like, oh, I used to like your show, but you can go fuck yourself. Or like, you know, you're a Muslim lover and all this stuff. And like the audience that they have are so kind of like, you know, they want like the extremities, they want the violence, they want the blood. And anyone who doesn't want the violence or like doesn't want to see the violence and doesn't want to see the blood are sort of considered enemies to them.
And they are manifesting this by just attacking any random non-white people they find in the street. They're making it very clear what it is that they see as their enemy, who is their enemy, and it's like everyone wants to prevaricate on this, but it's like no, like you let these people talk and you'll find out exactly what it is. And I know Riley, we've jumped in a bunch, but I'll bring it back to one thing. I mentioned this to you earlier, Hussein, which is that there's this anecdote. I mean, it's true, but about the Jane Elliott trying the blue eyes, brown eyes experiment in Britain, and it just completely failed because the audience basically just were like, no, that's bollocks. It's not racism. No, they do smell bad. And they just backed each other up, and nobody would take the position that like discrimination based on assumptions is wrong. And I don't necessarily take that to mean, oh, well, Americans are more aware of racism. It's more that like in America, there's this kind of received wisdom amongst white people that racism is bad and I'm not racist. And the worst thing you could do as a human being is to call me racist. That's actually worse than racism. Whereas in Britain, it's just sort of like there's a denial that there is such a thing as racism, unless it's anti-English racism, of course, the only and the worst kind.
Obviously.
And that to me, I feel like comes out in the way that this is portrayed, is that basically the downstream effect of that is that news media, politicians, people in positions of public prominence feel as though it is taking a left-wing partisan position to acknowledge the idea that there is such a thing as racism.